I was drafted in 1983, and I first went to basic training. Then after the basic training, I was promoted to a sergeant, and I was a commander of a rocket launching station for low-flying rockets. In other words, those rockets would hit the targets that are just a few hundred meters above the ground. And those launching stations were widely used in the Middle East and also whenever they needed to be used. So in my case, I have never participated in combat, so I was a commander of the station, but I was ready to go anytime, but I have never used these rockets. I was drafted, and every citizen of the Soviet Union back then, every boy, actually, or man, had to serve in the military. For women, military service was not mandatory, although there were a few women in support roles. They never participated in combat, of course. It's a relatively new thing, and it did not exist in the Soviet Union. So I was drafted, and then I served for 2 years. I went to the military. I could have probably dodged the draft, but most of my friends, they served in the military, and I decided, so just to be a man, I'll go to the military and serve, give my country the 2 years that it was required. Well, I was stationed in the Far East after I went through basic training in Ukraine that lasted for about half a year. I was sent to the Far East and was stationed there between the cities of Khabarovsk and Vladivostok. It was the unit actually was located right near the Chinese border, about 4 miles from the Chinese border, and many members of that unit in 1969, many years before I served in the military, or actually not that many, about 14, 15 years earlier before that, many of them were killed during that conflict, and that conflict was a big milestone in the relationship between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. There were some disagreements between the two countries, and China decided to annex or invade part of the Soviet territory, which received a very harsh response. The Soviet Union used napalm along the border, and then the response to the killing of a number of Soviet soldiers, the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of the Chinese troops were killed during that response by the Soviet Union. Then the relationships kind of stabilized, and but still were not as good for quite a few years. The people who live in a very close quarters for a long period of time, they develop usually a good relationship, and they learn how to live together. But still, there were lots of things that could have been much better. There was a lot of rivalry between groups of different ethnic and religious background, and also rivalry between the soldiers who were drafted earlier and served longer than the soldiers who were drafted just recently, and those conflicts would occasionally become very brutal. There were multiple injuries, even suicides, so it was pretty rough. And I really, at some points, I would not know who would I side with there, and who would I kill first, whether the enemy soldier or some of my comrades. I started serving in the military in the Ukraine. It was basic training, and the soldiers would occasionally be allowed to go to see the town where the unit was located, and it was quite a bit of fun. The civilian population in the Ukraine the people were very friendly to us. They would see us in the street. The girls would give us an apple or grapes, or we would occasionally be invited to share dinner. But then I had some disciplinary issues, and the commander of my unit decided to send me to the Far East, which is a really pretty rough region in the Soviet Union. If you look at the map, it's a maritime region between Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, right near, kind of squeezed between China and Japan, and the attitude of population in the maritime region was very different. First, the soldiers were not very well fed as compared to the Ukraine, and the diet was atrocious there. If you can call it a diet, it was the food was horrible. So the soldiers would go and look for food anywhere. They would use their own money to buy something in local grocery stores, and then they would go loot if there were opportunities. So the civilians were just simply afraid to see, when they see the soldier, they would, if there is nobody around, they would try to just stay away as much as possible. Actually, the perception of Americans among the Russian people was not that bad. On the personal level, Russian people have never expressed hostility toward Americans. It's more the rivalry was more among the governments. Altogether, Russians always looked at America as a competitor, as somebody that as a country that they should try to favorably stack against, but there was never any kind of intention or desire among Russian people to go invade to invade America. Altogether, was very favorable attitude. Not like now. Now the attitude is not as favorable as it used to be actually during the Soviet Union. Yes, I served in the military during the war with Afghanistan, and actually I tried to volunteer to go to Afghanistan, but because I already had a college degree and I was from Moscow, I was kind of considered an unreliable, overly educated individual who would not do any good if sent somewhere to a combat zone. So the impact of the war against Afghanistan was that the war against Afghanistan was essentially a rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. At that time, in 1983, when I just joined the military, the Soviet Union shut down a civilian Korean aircraft, and Ronald Reagan, the US president back then, called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And the Soviet Union, for the first time in the Soviet history, they announced the specific enemy who they were going to go into war, and the enemy was the United States of America. Before that, they would always call an enemy very vaguely. They would say world imperialism or something like that, but never mentioned any specific countries. So back then it was a pretty bad time, and there was actually a big danger that a major military conflict could come up between the United States and the Soviet Union. If that happened, so I would have to go to war, and I would have to participate in the war and follow the oath that I gave at the beginning of my service when I started the military service. And that's one of the things about the military. Sometimes you don't agree with something, but if you joined it, you have to follow orders. If you before you join the military, so think twice, or maybe more than twice. Talk to your relatives, talk to your friends. Don't make this decision just because you are in a mood to join the military, just for no reason. There should be a good reason why you want to join. And particularly in the United States, it's a voluntary experience, so nobody forces you to join it. So think about it, because when you join military, you will essentially forfeit many of your rights. You will have to follow orders, and if the orders are not necessarily aligned with what you think or what you agree, you still have to follow the orders. Military is not a discussion club, and you have to be able to sacrifice what you have, and if necessary, you will risk your life, and it's quite possible that you will lose your life. So think about it before you join the military, and think about not only about yourself, but also about your family, how it would impact them.